2005, and we're here at the Julian Zamora Library at the University of Notre Dame interviewing Andrew Connors from the National Hispanic Cultural Center. I'm Brookes Ebetsch. And Andrew, can you tell me a little bit about how you got interested in Latino art? You, like myself, seem to be a very unlikely candidate.
Well, it basically started when I was a child. My father was a high school teacher, and we grew up in Colorado. And my parents' best friends lived down in New Mexico, in Santa Fe, and their parents lived in Taos. So for Thanksgiving and Christmas and summers, we spent all of this time in New Mexico. And my father was the sort of teacher that wanted everything to be a classroom. And so we would go to the Indian pueblos, and we would go to the Hispanic towns, and we would go to Spanish Market, and we would visit with artists just because my father was interested. And as we were growing up, this was art. This is what we thought art was, in addition to the formal things that you see in the museums. But we made no differentiation because my father made no differentiation. He went to Taos Pueblo and saw it as a great work of architecture, the way that when we were older, we went to New York City and we saw great works of architecture in New York. So it was all one continuum of human creativity. And then I went east for college and went to Connecticut for school, and suddenly realized that all of the things that I had grown up thinking was art, really only about a half of it really was art. And much of the things that I thought was deepest from the heart and from the spirit, or specifically community-oriented art forms, basically were not included in art history classes. You didn't see them in the East Coast art museums. So I, being from the West, assumed that it was my Western ignorance and my hickdom that really established my misunderstanding of what important art was. And so went through 4 years of school and really sort of changed my direction, thinking, okay, what I thought was art really isn't. So I will do something else. And I was fortunate to get a job at the Smithsonian at a museum that did have some Native American art, a few pieces of Hispanic folk art from New Mexico, and a lot of Western painting and cowboy art, as it was frequently dismissed on the East Coast. And I realized that if this museum was interested in showing cowboy art that most East Coast museums would not show, perhaps they would also have an interest in some of the same traditional arts and community-based arts that I was interested in. So I began to work with the curators there and realized what actually was wrong was an East Coast mentality that the United States began in Boston and ended at the Hudson River, and that the rest of what was being produced was simply regional, as if New York is not a region. So I was fortunate to have some colleagues at the Smithsonian American Art Museum that really encouraged me to start pushing for acquisitions of the material that was not included in the museums in DC or New York or Miami or Los Angeles, for that matter. So I started working on the collection and had a great deal of support from my colleagues, most of whom were focused on the 19th century. Most of whom had no background in Latino art or Hispanic art. And so I just realized that this was something that other people felt was worthwhile, although they personally may not have wanted to do the work. So I was fortunate to be able to get to do the work and start teaching myself, because as I said, in college there were no courses that I could take on Latino, Hispanic, even Native American art for that matter, and very little on Latin America except pre-conquest material. So I did take some classes in Maya and Olmec and Aztec, but really nothing on Spanish colonial up to the present day. So I was basically self-taught, as much as I'd love to go back and take some of these courses. So yes, my gringo, Anglo, honky, mixed white generic American, really has nothing to do with my passion. But I think that while it certainly prevents me from having any sort of insider knowledge, I do have a perspective that I think is worthwhile, just as a person from North America can study Asian art and have something worthwhile to say about Asian art, or African art for that matter. But I've always felt very welcomed by the artists that I've worked with. And one of the things that I really love most is talking to the artists and hearing from them and passing their stories on to a larger audience. And I do sometimes feel very uncomfortable in that I am invited as a white guy to go and talk in mainstream organizations the way that an artist, a Latino artist, or a Latino scholar might not be asked. So there have been many times when I've really felt that I am coming in to do their token ethnic project, and the organization is not even committed enough to ask somebody from the community to talk about their own culture and their own heritage and visual expression. But I also feel it's important for people to realize that the art is being produced that's very powerful, very strong. And so I do take those opportunities to spread the word. And so I guess it's a long way of answering that question.
So I'm interested in knowing, you went to school and all of your concept of art had been changed. Did you immediately think, well, I have to work at the Smithsonian because they're very prestigious? Or did you actually think, oh, well, maybe the Smithsonian has some of the stuff that I want to do? Or did you just fall into the job at the Smithsonian? How did you choose the Smithsonian?
Well, I basically took a different turn during college. I decided that I was going to go into the design side of things and not the curatorial, not museums, because I really, the art that I would have wanted to study was simply not considered real. So I decided that I would go into exhibition design, product design, and that sort of thing. So I got an internship at the American Art Museum for one summer in the exhibition design department, and worked there between junior and senior year. And then after senior year, I was given another internship at the Hirshhorn Museum. And at the end of my internship at the Hirshhorn, one of the curators at the American Art Museum called up, because they're good at looking after their interns, and said, Andrew, we're doing a show of New Mexican art, and we remember all of your talking about the Western art and folk art, and we were wondering if you would be interested in working with us for a year on this exhibition as a research assistant. And I said, well, thanks very much, but no, I'm not going to go into the curatorial side of things. I'm going to go to New York and go into design. And I said, but thanks very much. And this was a week before I was supposed to end my internship and go up to New York. So I got off the phone, and my colleagues at the Hirshhorn said, what, are you crazy? It's a one-year job. It'll be good on your resume. Go up and work with them, and then during that year, you can do the rest of your search to find your design job or whatever you want to do. So I sheepishly called them back up again, and they said, well, that's great. Do you have a writing sample? And I said, no. And they said, okay, well, could you come in for an interview tomorrow? So I went in for an interview on Friday. I guess they liked it, and they said, okay, well, how about if we give you a research topic, and you'll have all weekend to do research at the Library of Congress, and you can turn it in on Monday. Well, I had to leave right after work on Friday to go up to New York to sign for an apartment. My apartment, my housemate had been looking for all summer long, and she found this great place. So I went up, met with her, signed the lease on the apartment, came back down again on Sunday, spent the rest of the day in the Library of Congress, wrote up this piece on an old manual typewriter, and turned it in on Monday morning. And they said, they called me up by lunchtime and said, terrific, we'd love to have you. You can't start next week, but how about the week after? So then I was in DC for a year, and then stayed for 15. So a couple of, the right jobs opened up, and I filled in temporarily for a while, and then ultimately was given a permanent job as one of the assistant curators. So, so that sort of vision was started with that opening opening exhibition, and it was called Art in New Mexico: Paths to Taos and Santa Fe, in 1900 to 1945, and I was the research assistant, and I pulled in a lot of the loans because I knew all the people. I'd grown up with all the people that worked in the museums. So it was a great opportunity to really sort of introduce them to my enthusiasm for Western topics and to the issues and sensitivities of dealing with ethnic arts, particularly Native American and the Hispanic, the Spanish-speaking New Mexican culture.
So how did you get into then graffiti art, which seems to be kind of on the other end of the Latino art spectrum?
Well, actually I see graffiti art very much, at least the sort of early school of graffiti, the early movements of graffiti, as absolutely a community-based art form. It is traditional art that was passed on from practitioner to practitioner. It's only now when graffiti has sort of moved into a hip-hop connection that it seems to be just anybody who wants to do it practices it and expresses themselves that way. But the graffiti that I'm most interested in is, the early Mexicano, the Chicano, Pachuco style of graffiti that really was a community aesthetic that was not intended to be art for the masses or for another public. It was art to be read within that community. And the same was true, although to a lesser extent, in the New York hip-hop graffiti scene in the early 70s, when the writers were really writing for each other. They were writing on the trains and getting their message out, but they really were writing for the community of writers so that they could all see each other's work. So in many ways, that's a very traditional way of passing on art. It's not learned in schools. It's not published in books. It's passed on through oral tradition and through basically the apprenticing of a younger writer to an older writer to basically learn the skills. There's a whole range of visual art in the middle ground there. And I think one of the reasons why I've really been focusing on Latino art pretty much exclusively in my passions and in my research and exhibitions is because you see so little of it in mainstream museums. And if I, as a mainstream white guy curator that fits all the sort of standard molds of a white guy curator, can help introduce this material to people that ordinarily might say, I don't do that, or it's not my stuff, then I take that role very seriously and enjoy it a great deal. But I would certainly not want, and I think I'm always very clear to indicate that I understand my outsider status. But there's something about so many of the different expressions of different Latino artists that just speaks to me as a person on a base human level that transcends the specificity of culture and is basically a human expression. And that's what I love about it, that it can speak to everybody. Occasionally, viewers need translators. And I don't mean literal language translator, I mean a visual translator or a cultural translator. And if I can play that role, I'm very happy to do it because I think everybody gets more enlightened by seeing the work of these great artists.
What was your first opportunity to do your own research in that area?
It really was northern New Mexico traditional culture. And I started in the PhD program at George Washington University, and many of my first papers were focused on northern New Mexico traditional culture. I did a lot of research on the WPA period in New Mexico and how the United States federal government attempted to come in and help support the traditional arts in New Mexico. So I did a lot of oral histories as well as archival research, both in Washington, D.C. and in New Mexico, on traditional northern New Mexico transmission of art forms from one generation to the next, and how the government, the institution of government programs, steered and sometimes, in my opinion, misdirected the attention to art forms that were lesser forms than some of those that could have been championed. Mostly New Mexico traditional arts, and then I realized that culture had sort of evolved into a more tame Chicano culture in New Mexico. So then I was interested in seeing, well, how did the New Mexico Chicano culture relate to California and Texas and Chicago and other areas where Mexicanos were really sort of expressing themselves in the 1960s. Then I realized that there were great parallels in Puerto Rico. Then I was fascinated with the contrast with the Cuban American community, which seemed to have less of the rural struggle aspect and seemed to have more of a European sort of focus in culture and heritage. And so I just kept expanding the artists that I was interested in. And I'm pretty much focused on contemporary artists, living artists, because I find them more fun to talk to than dead ones. But I also think it's very important that those of us that deal with contemporary art know just how many centuries of art has been created by Spanish-speaking peoples in what is now the United States. So I'm also very interested in tracking down the earlier artists, artists from the 1870s and 80s in California, Fortunato Areola, artists that are certainly not family names, household names, and not even museum names in most cases. And then around the turn of the century, Javier Martinez from the Bay Area. So there were major artists that were creating fine art, which would not folk art or not culturally specific art, but art in a mainstream tradition that simply just don't make it into the history books. So I love the whole sweep, because the sweep is the story of the United States. Yes, it could be the story simply of the Spanish-speaking or peoples of Mexican heritage in the United States or Latino heritage, but ultimately it basically boils down to the United States story. And but it's that part of the story that isn't in history, isn't written down.
Do you have a most memorable experience that you could share with us about doing research? An artist you met that you thought, wow, this is the guy I've been waiting to meet? Or some challenge that you experienced while you were doing some of your early research?
Well, I think there's so many moments like that. I think it's hard to sort of think of one off the top of my head, although I know exactly the moment when I began to become interested in graffiti, and that was at the opening of the Chicano Art Resistance and Affirmation exhibition in Los Angeles in 1990 at the White Art Gallery at UCLA. And the UCLA exhibition was late in opening. They were doing lots of last-minute things, so there were several hours of delays. And my girlfriend and I had flown, well, we went to Salt Lake first to visit her family and then came to Los Angeles, and we were ready to see the show. We finally got in, and I was trying to see as much of the exhibition as possible. And so we sort of split off, and I continued on. And I came back and found her maybe a third of the way into the exhibition. And she was writing in her notebook looking at this painting that I had sort of quickly walked by. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Have you seen this? Have you seen this? This is all text. It's all words. It's names." And it was the painting Placa Roll Call by Chaz Bojorquez. And so we began to look at it, and she's much more savvy as a visual interpreter than I am. And so we were looking at it, and we were talking about it. And she said, "You ought to, when the show comes to Washington, D.C., you ought to talk to him and find out if he does programs." And so I called him up after we left L.A. and began a 15-year friendship and real eye-opening experience knowing Chaz Bojorquez. And one of the most wonderful things is that painting we acquired for the Smithsonian collections, as well as a number of other pieces of his. And his work speaks to scholars of abstract expressionism, of anybody who knows good art, good painting will respond immediately to his work. And yet he is so well respected within the community of writers, of street artists in Los Angeles. So that was a real eye-opening experience for how there can be this crossover without an artist having to give up who they are, or give up their cultural identity, give up their community base as an artist, and yet still the mainstream art world, if forced by somebody's enlightened girlfriend, just sort of banged in the head saying, look at this, notice what's going on. So I really give Laurie a lot of credit for drawing that to my attention. And then for Chaz, he's just been the most gregarious, the most generous guide through not only Los Angeles and all of the artists of all different cultural backgrounds, but also a guide through his capacious brain. He thinks so expansively and with such a worldview and a generosity of spirit that that really was one of those moments when I thought, this is what I've got to do. This is what I was born to do.
Do you have a favorite show that you've helped to curate or been part of?
Well, I think just because I've done many exhibitions that are deeply researched and scholarly and expose new ideas and that sort of thing. But the show that I think was most eye-opening to most people was a show that really, unfortunately, it was Rolodex curation. I curated it out of my Rolodex when I got to Albuquerque, because we had to open a museum in 10 months, and my boss, Dr. Helen Lucero, said, you've got to do a show of, greatest hits. And so I picked 50 artists, Latino artists, and borrowed their work from private collectors, or in most cases from the artists themselves. And it was called La Luz, Contemporary Latino Art in the United States. And I chose the title La Luz to basically counter all of the black legend and the idea of darkness and gloom and death imagery and that sort of thing. I really wanted to say these are enlightened and enlightening artists who create really fascinating works of art. And it was a very well-received exhibition in Albuquerque, although because we were a new organization, not many people saw it. And unfortunately, the catalog is all in manuscript form, but we didn't have the money to actually print it after it was all designed. So there's no concrete document that's left of it. But by introducing so many new artists to people in New Mexico, I really had a great deal of fun doing that. What I did want to title the exhibition, though, was La Luz, Contemporary Art in the United States, and leave out Latino or any culturally specific identifier, because I really wanted to counter all of those hundreds of thousands of exhibitions that talk about American art, and there's not a single artist of color in those exhibitions. So I wanted to say, yes, you can do an entire exhibition of contemporary art in the United States and not show a single Anglo artist. But my boss said, let's help our visitors a little bit. You can make your political statement somewhere else, but let's be a little helpful to the visitors. And the artists were incredibly generous, willing to lend works to a museum that didn't exist yet. And so that was a fun project.
What has your experience been like, having the ability to come in on the ground floor of a brand new organization working with, obviously speaking of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, that you got to be there for the beginning, and now you're working harder to keep it going and keep the momentum up. What's that experience like, especially in comparison to coming into the Smithsonian, such an incredibly well-established location?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think, first Helen Lucero was hired as the Director of Visual Arts, and then she asked me to apply for the job of the curator, to work with her, so I was thrilled to do that. And I had really stiff competition from a department store window dresser, I think was my closest competition, luckily, so I got the job. And basically what she said is, we have to invent this museum. We have to define it. We have to define its parameters and really figure out what we are going to be doing, how we're going to shape it. And as you indicated, coming from the Smithsonian, a museum that was 154 years old at that time, to a museum that was soon, opening in 10 months, was a world of difference. But it meant that we had to invent all the forms and figure out all the processes and everything. But because both Helen and I had many years of museum experience, we basically pulled on all of our contacts. And thank goodness for having those years at the Smithsonian, because we could call up the lighting designer at the Smithsonian and say, what track systems do we need? What light fixtures do we need? What are the standard light levels? You know, all of those basic things that I didn't know. I wasn't a lighting designer. And Helen pulled together a number of different collections management policies from different museums, and we sort of consolidated them into a manuscript that now is the sort of defining book for the collections at the Cultural Center. So it was a great adventure, but when I look back and read some of those memos and some of the reports and everything that we had to do, I think, how did we do it? How did we get that place up and open so quickly and manage to get through all of the bureaucracy of the state of New Mexico and convince all of the other people up through the bureaucracy that what we felt was important was actually the proper way to do it. So it was a challenge, but I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to do it.
Is there anything that you haven't been able to get to yet that you've really wanted to, or an artist that you've thought, oh, I just keep missing this person, I really want to get an opportunity to talk to them, or something new that you've heard about happening that you're really looking forward to working on?
Well, that's happened increasingly since I've been in Albuquerque, because we just don't have any travel funds. So often my relationships with artists are based on correspondence and phone calls. For instance, Martina Lopez right here at the University of Notre Dame. She's an artist whose work I've loved for years and years, and I've never had the opportunity to lay eyes on her. So it's that sort of thing, that there are so many different artists that I would love to meet and spend more time with. I do have a grant to do a major show on Chicano graffiti, focusing primarily on Chaz Bojorquez, and I just haven't had the time to really start on that project. Doing this much bureaucracy and paperwork, you sometimes don't get the time to do the research that you want to do. And I would love to do that. I would love to go back to being a full-time curator, where you really get to spend your time doing research and thinking and writing about artists and promoting their work, as opposed to filling out all the forms to purchase the paper clips, which is what I spend a lot of time doing these days.
Well, Andrew, I want to thank you so much for coming here to Notre Dame today. We've really enjoyed having you, and I can't wait to see more of your exhibits and hear more of things that are going to be happening at the National Hispanic Cultural Center.
Thank you very much, Brooks.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.